Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Chullin Daf Chet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Mark Baker in honor of Shoshana Bluma. Shabbat Shalom with much love. We're going to get started. I'll mention that Geffen went up yesterday about Daf Vav, that really interesting story with the Hahus Saba with the Kutim, and he sent the messenger to get it, and the Hahus Saba. So it's an interesting Geffen, a bit of a different style of Geffen than usual, so worth listening to. And there's lots of other content that went up. Gita's introduction to Chullin. Gita is back with her introductions, which is great. So there's an introduction to Chullin up, a written introduction. It's great to print before Shabbat, right? You can't always print the shiurim that are audio, but you can print that. And Shuli also had an article that went up this week. Just one second. I'm blanking right now for a quick second on the topic, but I'm going to look it up, and then I will remind about the Orviim in the name of towns. So this is all good material if you haven't gotten to it yet to print it up before Shabbat. Okay, and Alana's shiur this week again, which I mentioned of Din and Daf, was all about shechita and the mitzvah of shechita and using it as a case, as a prototype for learning about how we count mitzvot and issues like that. So with that, we're going to get started. Today, as opposed to yesterday and the day before, which were very, very interesting depim, kind of from a different realm. Today, we're going to be back to the nitty-gritty of kashrut, or of, I should say, slaughtering. But what's interesting about today's stuff, and that's why I accidentally said kashrut, is that we're going to get into all sorts of principles about kashrut that sort of just get weaved into the daf, which are very interesting. So while we might be kind of tedious about, we're talking about knives that are using for slaughtering and all sorts of very technical details, but I want you to hold within you the idea that we're going to have access in this daf to many different principles that are relevant for laws of kashrut. Okay. Amar Rabbi Zeira. With that, we're going to get started. Rabbi Zeira has a statement. The kashrut is going to be more in the second part of today's daf. Amar Rabbi Zeira, Amar Shmuel. So Rabbi Zeira says in the name of Shmuel, Libain, which, by the way, I didn't look this up, but it's not so common that Rabbi Zeira is quoting Shmuel. But if anybody wants to do a search about that, right, it's usually Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Nachman. There's the typical people that are always quoting Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Zeira is not exactly typically quoting Shmuel, but here he quotes Shmuel. Libain sakin v'shachapa shchitato kshera. If I take a knife and I heat it up, my slaughtering knife, and then I slaughter with it, it's valid. Now, what's the issue? Why wouldn't it be valid? Okay, who cares if the knife is hot or not? Well, again, what we're discussing in this first chapter a lot, we're going to be discussing a lot more, we haven't gotten really into it yet, is this whole idea of a treifa. A treifa is not like we call meat treif. Okay, we think that's non-kosher meat. It's true, we call it treif, but a treifa is a particular type of non-kosher meat. It's a type of meat that could have been slaughtered completely in the correct manner, but, technically we did the action of shechita as opposed to a nevela, which is the animal died without a proper shechita. But the animal was sick in a way that, again, the typical definition, although we're going to see this more inside, the machloket about it, but it's an animal that was going to die probably, the basic definition is the standard is within 12 months. So if something's wrong with the animal, it's missing a leg, it's got some hole in the stomach, something like that. Okay, some treifas you can see on the outside, some treifas you can't see till you slaughter the animal and open it and then see, oh, there was some problem. Okay, anyway, he says like this, if you heat up that knife and you slaughter the animal, what's the problem? Well, as you're slaughtering the animal, before you cut the two simanim, which is the kanen, the veshet in Hebrew, which is the windpipe and the gullet of the animal, if you're cutting, okay, with a hot knife, you're going to end up burning the animal and kind of ruining the animal, perhaps before you finish the shechita. And then in the end, when you slaughter it, you're actually slaughtering a treifa. That's the potential issue here. But Shmuel says it's not an issue. Your shechita is fine. You haven't caught the animal to be a treifa before you finish the shechita. Why not? Chiduda kodem lelibuna. Why is this? Because the knife, okay, let's think of the knife. The knife has two sides, right? The two sides and the blade, the sharp part. The sharp part is going to hit the animal before the sides do. Okay, so the chiduda, the sharpness of it, now we're going to assume, right, comes before it's going to heat up the animal. So you're already going to slice get the two simanim, we're going to call them, right, the windpipe and gullet. Those two simanim you're going to cut before it actually has a chance to ruin the animal. Okay, now that's it. Now, literally what they mean here is chidudah, the sharpness of the knife will slaughter the animal before you actually, till the libun happens. What's libun? We know that from laws of kashering things. You use hot, right, like a flame, right, till the heat, basically, till the heat ruins the animal. So the Gemara says, "Vahikat stadim," but what do you mean? There's the sides of the knife, which carry the heat. They're going to touch the animal at the same time, to which they say no. Beit hashchita mirvach ravach. In other words, what they're suggesting at first that maybe when you start cutting the siman already, okay, think about it, right? You start going into the neck of the animal, and then already the blade is like touching, right? And it's gonna already heat up before you finish the shechita, because it has to not be a treifa before the end of the shechita, after you completely sever both simanim. So they say no, because what happens? Now, imagine a balloon. If you cut a balloon, what's going to happen? The two sides that you cut are going to immediately jump back, right? And if you had a knife going in there, the blade would never touch the sides of the balloon, because as soon as you hit the balloon with the knife, both sides kind of spring out. So that's what they're saying here. Beit hashchita mirvach ravach. It spreads out. And as soon as you start cutting the simanim, it already separates and your knife is actually not going to touch it. Okay, so the heat is going to come later, in which case that's fine because you've already slaughtered the animal. So that's why Rabbi Zeira says in the name of Shmuel, this is completely fine. Now we're going to leave this topic. We're going to go to a different question, which is similar, you'll see, but in a completely different topic, in a leprous mark. Okay, we're going to talk about leprous marks. There's going to be a few building blocks you're going to have to understand before we get to the actual point. And then they're going to ask this question. So it'll take us a few minutes till we understand the question. Then in their attempts to answer the question, they're going to bring two sources. The first one being the statement of Rabbi Zeira in the name of Shmuel. And that's why this is here. Okay, that's why this question about leprosy, which seems to have nothing to do with it, is here. In the end, we're not going to be able to get to an answer from either of these two sources because we're going to distinguish between the cases. But the situation is like this. Okay, before we even start, I'm going to talk about the fact that there's two types of leprous marks that we're going to discuss today. One is called shechin, which you know from the 10 plagues, it's boils, and one is called michve, which means from a burn. Now, what it means here is that you could have something that's called shechin. Now, it's called a boil, but what we really mean is, and we're going to see the differences between them, the Gemara is going to say, what is shechin, what is michve? So maybe I'll just wait for 1 minute about that. But we're going to see that these are two different types of leprous marks, which something happens. Okay, we assume like leprosy just kind of grows. But these are leprous marks that grow as a result of something, some sort of injury that the person had, and from that grew a leprous mark. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about now. Ibayelu. So now we have a question. Libain shapud. Okay, somebody takes a skewer, vihikabo, and Libain heats up the skewer and then hits somebody with the skewer. So this person now was hit, so they have a wound from the blow, and they were also burned. Mishum shechin nidon or mishum michve nidon? So the question is, do we call this a leprous mark of shechin, which we're going to learn is something, among other things, one of the ways you get a leprous mark from shechin, and that's what causes it, is a blow, okay, a hit. Somebody hits you. Or is it mishum michve, which is a leprous mark that grows from a burn? Okay, so now, before we explain what shechin is, what michve is, they're going to say, l'may nafkamina, what's the relevance of this question? Who cares? In the end, it's a leprous mark. It's shechin or it's michve. What does make a difference what we call it? Okay, so they're going to say it for the following braita. Shechin u'michve mitamim. B'shavua echad b'shnei simanim, not to be confused with the two simanim we're talking about here. Two simanim that we're going to be talking about throughout Masechet Chullin are generally what we mean by two simanim. Right? Two simanim can mean lots of things. There could be simanim of bagrut. Simanim are indicators, okay? But in our case, in our Masechet, generally, other than this mention, but generally two simanim mean the gullet and the windpipe, which are the two parts of the animal that have to be slaughtered to make the slaughter of kosher shechita. But these simanim mean two signs. When the Kohen comes, now if you remember the way leprosy works, the Kohen comes and looks at it. Then, after he sees the way the mark looks, he's going to quarantine the person for 7 days, and then he's going to look a second time. So there's two indicators, that would be the best way to translate these simanim, of shechin and michve, which makes it sound like they're pretty much the same. Okay? B'se'ar lavan u'b'pisyon. The first thing is if a white hair grew from it within the week of quarantine, and if it's spread, okay, it got bigger. Those are two signs. If those two things happen, the Kohen is going to say this is a leper, right? There's a leprous mark. The lama chilkana katuv. So if basically they're both the same for the simanim and all that, why did the Torah call them two separate names? Really one and the same thing. And this is what we're looking for. Lomar she'en mitztarfim ze im ze. Now, in order for something to be a leprous mark, it also needs to have a minimum requisite amount. It's called it's called a grease, the size of a grease, which is kind of like a bean. So now we're going to say the following. What if I had a leprous mark that was shechin, okay? Then it was only a chatzi grease. It was only half a grease. Then I got this wound from someone that hit me with this hot skewer. And we have to determine, do we call it shechin or do we call it michve? Now, if we call it shechin and it's another half a grease, then the two will combine and I'll have a leprous mark. If it's michve, they won't combine and I won't be considered a person with a leprous mark. I won't be a leper because the two can't combine. That's the nafkamina. Okay. Vitanya, but we still have things to build, which is we still have the building blocks to understand the sugya. Ezu shechin ve'ezu michve. So what's the difference? Now we're going to get in detail what is called a leprous mark from boils and what is called a leprous mark from a burn. Laka be'etz be'even. Okay, if someone is hit with wood or stone, that's from the blow. Or begefet or b'chamitveria. Okay, gefet is the dregs of the olives, which have, or the, I think it's olive, like the psolet, the bad stuff. So they create heat, okay, but it's a natural heat. This you might remember, we talked about this in Masechet Shabbat. And chametveria are natural, right, heated springs, the hot springs of Tiberia. So these are things that are naturally heated. So boils could also either come from a blow or they come from a burn, but a burn from something naturally heated, as opposed to, one more line here, and anything else that's not heated up by a fire, okay, but something that's naturally heated, like for example, so now they're saying, what is that coming to add? Latuye aval me'ikaro. This includes lead that comes from the source, right? If you're mining lead and the lead that comes from the ground is hot, naturally hot, so it will include that as well. Okay, now I just want to follow in the English because I don't remember all these words and how they translate into English. So, okay, ezu michve. So now, what is michve? Michve begachelet, okay, that's a coal. You're burned with a coal. That was obviously heated. Beremetz, which is hot ashes. That also, by the way, came up a lot in Masechet Shabbat. These were all terms we used when we talked about bishul on Shabbat, cooking on Shabbat. Besid roteach, boiling limestone. Begifsit roteach, boiling gypsum, okay, which is some other kind of material. The Koran has a good note about it. Gypsum is a sulfite deposit similar to limestone, consisting of calcium and sulfite. They give you the number, of the element. Anyway, okay, we're not going to get into these details. Or bechol davar b'machmat or anything that's heated by fire, including gypsum. Did I say gypsum? Okay, so gypsum. Thank you. No, it is gypsum. Oh, sorry, gypsum. Okay, thank you. And or with anything that's heated by fire, which would include what? Water heated by fire. Okay, so all of these are things that are heated by the fire. That's michve. Okay, so now we built almost everything, but now we have one more thing to build in order to explain this. So now Vitanya, shechin u'michve. Now, until now, fine. So it's very clear. It's either shechin or it's michve. Okay, depending on what it was. Now they say Vitanya, shechin u'michve. What if it's a combo of both? And that's really what we have here. Because we have the blow of the skewer, but we also have the skewer was heated by fire. So it's got both in it. So now another Braita says when you have both, which affected, and then you have both shechin and michve, and then a leprous mark comes, how do we determine whether it's shechin or whether it's michve? Im shechin kodem lemichve, it all depends on the order. If the shechin comes first you were hit, then you were burned, then bitel michve shechin. We always go by the last thing that happened to you. We assume that the last thing is what caused the leprous mark to come out. So in that case, the michve, the burn, was what came last. So it's a burn. Ve'im michve kodemet l'shechin, and if the burn came first and then the blow, bitel shechin et hamichve. So then the shechin is going to nullify the michve, and we're going to go by the shechin. So we just follow the last thing that happens. So now, okay, after we built all the different parts, these are all the building blocks to understanding the question. Now we go back to our question. So what's our case? Let's remember what we asked in the beginning. Libein shapud v'hikabo. Heated up a skewer and then hit the person with the skewer. Is it shechin? Is it michve? So now you see why this is similar to our statement of Rabbi Zeira in the name of Shmuel. Kigon dehave beis. So now you have to go back and figure out what this question is, because the only nafkamina is if you had a chatzi grease already. So kigon dehave bechatzi grease shechin meikara. So you had half a grease of shechin from the beginning. Then libein shapu v'ikabo. Somebody heated up this skewer and hit you with it. V'nafak bechatzi grease acher, and another chatzi grease appears of a leprous mark. Again, this happens over time. It's not like an immediate thing. My. So now what do we say? Chavata kadim v'ate havlam v'vatale lechavata. What really affected the person first? Because it really kind of happened at the same time. You got hit and burned. So do we say the blow is what came first, and then ate havlam v'vatale lechavta, and then you got burned after the skewer hit you initially, then it burned you. And therefore, what are we going to say? The burn is what overwhelms right? The burn is what determines it. So it's michve. Now you have half a grease of shechin and half a grease of michve. They do not combine, right? V'havale shechin u'michve v'lo mitztarfin, and they don't combine. Odilma, or perhaps we say havlakadim. It first affected you by the heat. The burn is what came first. V'ate chavata, and then the blow came u'mavatale lahavla. And then and then canceled out and said, oh no, this is what's determining things. So then you're going to have shechin, shechin, umitztar. And then you're going to have shechin, and because both are from there, and therefore they will combine. So that's our question. It took a long time to figure that out. That's what they're asking. So Tashma, now you can see why they brought our source. Because they say, Amar Rabbi Zeira Amar Shmuel, libein sakin v'shachat ba shlitato kshera. Why? Chiduda kodem lelibuna, because the knife hits before the heat. So why don't we say the same thing with the skewer? The skewer, the sharp part of it, the blade, hits before the heat, and therefore the heat is the last part. The heat is what's going to determine, and they're not going to combine. To which they say, that's going to say alma chavata kadim, right? So therefore we're going to say the blow hit first, and then they're not going to combine. To which the Gemara says, no. Chidud shane. Chidud shane basically means that we're going to say this is different. Rashi says, mitoch shu chad ein havalo shebo chazak v'chatichato kodem lahavlo. In a knife, what's a blade? A blade is very thin, and the sharpness of the blade is what's going to hit you first. Because think about it, in a blade, and we talked about this before, or maybe I forgot to mention this, but I don't remember. But in the blade, it's very thin, which means it doesn't conduct heat so much. The real heat is in the sides of the blade, right? The two sides, which are much longer, so the width of them is going to retain the heat. But the part where the blade is very narrow. It's not going to really retain the heat, and that is very sharp. So it's going to hit first. That's what's going to create the impact, the blade of the knife. When you're talking about a skewer, sometimes a skewer is thicker. And because it's thicker, actually the heat is going to possibly hit first, and therefore the heat might affect it first and only after the blow. Okay, so that's the distinction they make. They're going to make a similar but a bit of a different distinction from this next source, Tashma. Libein shapu v'hikabo. Now this is going to be a direct source about our case, and it's going to seem to say the same thing. So libein shapu v'hikabo, if you heated up this skewer and hit someone, nidom mishum michvat esh. It's going to be called michve. Alma chavat kadim. So it must be the blow is what hits first, and then just like we tried to prove a minute ago. And therefore, we're going to go by the second part, which is the heat. So they say, no hatamnami de barze mivras. Okay, so what does this mean? Rashi's saying it could be that case was where the person was stabbed. Okay, notice it did, right? It said ikabo, but ikabo could be stabbed. If you stab a person rather than hit them with it, right, then it makes sense that the heat is we're gonna say the blow is gonna come first, and then the heat, but not necessarily the case in what they're asking. So again, they make distinctions and they say you can't really learn it from here. Okay. One second. Right. Sorry. I think I just explained that wrong. Rashi says, Mivra is shaloi kau b'koch ela tekaro. Right. No. Right. If you do the stabbing, he says, ve'en kan chavata ela hevel. Right. Then you don't have the blow, you have the heat. Right. I think that, I can't remember. If you stab them, then you're ending up actually the heat is going in right from the beginning. Can't remember now if I said that. I think that's what I said, but if not, I'm correcting myself. If then the hevel, the heat is going in right away because you're stabbing it, it's going in. But in our case, you could say maybe it's hika, like if you just smack someone with it, then it's different. Okay, then you might say the blade is going to hit first. Okay, if you're going to like cut someone with it as opposed to stabbing them. Okay, so basically they say you can't necessarily infer it from there, even though the language is really the same. But I think they're just suggesting that maybe there's two different ways of hitting. One is stabbing, one is more hitting. The word tahainu chidub most people take out, so we're not going to read those words. Okay, so this part of the daf was a little confusing, but fairly straightforward. We had a halacha of Rabbi Zeira in the name of Shmuel. Then, after we have that halacha for shechita, this works, we then try to compare it to a case of leprosy. So, in other words, again, we stop for a minute with our sugya. We take a question that was asked about leprosy, and in the context of that question, after they finally explained the complications of that question and what it meant, they then said they tried to answer the question from bringing the statement of Shmuel, but in the end, they distinguished between that, and they tried to bring a braita and said maybe that braita doesn't prove anything. Now we're going to move into a different realm. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua. Sakin shel avodah zara mutar lishchot ba, v'asur lachtoch ba basar. If you have a knife that was used for idol worship, okay, probably what they assume this means, it was used for slaughtering an animal that was going to be brought as a sacrifice for idol worship. Okay, you can't benefit from something that was used for idol worship, right? So if a knife was used to slaughter an animal for idol worship, you can't benefit from that. That's what's called isurei hana'ah, forbidden to benefit from anything used for idol worship. So if you take this avodah zarah knife, this knife that was used, well, guess what? You can slaughter with it. Mutar lishchot ba. It's a little weird. Aren't you benefiting? So we're going to talk about that in a minute. V'asur lachtoch ba basar. You can't use it at your table and cut your meat with it, okay, or in the kitchen and chop the meat. That you can't do, but you can use it for slaughtering. Why is this? Mutar lishchot ba mikalkelhu. You can slaughter because you're actually ruining the animal by slaughtering. Now, this is fascinating, right? What do you think? What do you mean? You're fixing it. I'm making myself food. But animals, I want you to think about the world of animals in those days, right? Nowadays, we don't really use animals for too many purposes, right? We don't have animals plowing our fields and all that. But in those days, they used animals for plowing. Okay, Rashi gives us a whole list. They used animals for, they bred them. They had them have offspring. They plowed with them and they ate them. Okay. But eating was always the last resort. If you remember, we talked about selling a shore for slaughter and an ox for plowing. Okay, and the ox for plowing is worth more money because, first of all, you have many uses of it, as opposed to an animal that you're going to slaughter, and that's the end of your animal. So people usually only slaughter the animal when they can't work anymore, or they can't use them for other purposes, or if they're desperate for food. But generally, it's not a good thing to slaughter an animal, even though, in the end, you do want the meat. So there we call it mekalka. This, by the way, reminds us of Masechet Shabbat and all sorts of, if it's a different issue there, but if you're mekalka, you're ruining something, it's not a creative malacha, but that's for a different reason, okay? This is, in order to benefit, it has to be something beneficial to you. It's not really beneficial to slaughter it. But but cutting the meat, you're actually fixing it. So comes Rava with an interesting line, and he says, Amar Rava pa'amim shashochet asur. And he's going to say in pa'amim that the mechatech is mutar, but sometimes it's flipped. Because sometimes you actually benefit from a slaughter, and sometimes you don't benefit from cutting the meat. What's the example he gives? Pa'amim shashochet asur b'misukenet. If the animal's going to become a treifa very soon, you see it's starting to go, okay, but it's not yet a treifa. And if you wait any longer, so you'll never be able to slaughter this animal. So right then and there, you want to slaughter it, because otherwise you won't end up with being able to slaughter this animal ever, right? But it won't be kosher. And mechatech mutar ba'at medekayim on the korbana. If you want to give a slab of meat to someone as a gift, then you don't want it cut, because as soon as you start cutting it, right, like if you cut up fruit, it has a much shorter shelf life. So if you're giving someone a gift, okay, if you're giving someone a slab of meat as a gift, I don't know if you've ever done that. It sounds a little weird for us, but if you give someone a slab of meat, you want a slab of meat. You don't want it cut, right? You want like the big piece of meat. You don't want it cut into pieces. It actually ruins it. So, by the way, just korban is a korban, but here they mean a gift. Okay, just so you realize that. Okay, now they say, wait a minute. I don't understand this whole sugya at all. I took a knife that they used to slaughter an animal for avodah zarah, which obviously they didn't do a kosher shechita. The animal's not kosher. So doesn't the knife absorb from the fat of the non-kosher animal? And shouldn't the knife be forbidden no matter what? Shouldn't it be forbidden because of the fat of the meat? And this is going to be our topic for the rest of the day, which is the fat from the meat gets absorbed into the knife. Okay, so if it's non-kosher because it was used for avodah zarah purposes, how could I use this knife for my purposes? So, right, to slaughter an animal. So the Gemara answers, turning out on a bet, we're talking about a knife that was never used. Didn't we say it was used for idol worship? Because first of all, you might remember that in idol worship, if you designate something for use for idols, even if, okay, it's called muktzah, you designate it, even if you didn't use it, it's actually forbidden, or there's a machloket about it. So now they say, chadasha bein Rabbi Shmuel bein Rabbi Akiva, misham she'avodah zarah hein, umisham she'avodah zarah einan asurin ad she'avdu. There's a machlok between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva about something, but they don't argue in our case. Because our case, it's not that they were using the knife to worship idols. The knife was serving the purpose of something else which was used for idol worship. Now, nobody thinks that that's going to be forbidden just by designating it. Okay? That's not an issue no matter what. So, basically, we're going to say, okay, so chadasha, if it's new, then there's no even discussion here of is it forbidden to benefit and can you slaughter and can you chop meat. Of course, you could do anything you want because it's not even forbidden. So you can't say it's brand new, and that's why you don't have to worry about the fat. Okay, second attempt to answer. We're going to have two answers now that are possible answers. Ibait ema de pasik bagavza la'avodah zarah. Okay, perhaps it's talking about a case where you pasik bagavza la'avodah zarah. Sorry, I'm just blanking for a second what this is. You cut the... Oh, sorry. I just forgot blanked what this is. 1 second. Just look it up. Right. Gavzeh. That's what it is. It's wood. You were cutting wood. You weren't cutting the animal at all. Okay. We talked about a knife that was used for avodah zarah. We assumed from the beginning that we were talking about a slaughtering knife, but maybe you used it to cut the wood to burn the fire for the animal. So then there's no meat absorbed, non-kosher meat absorbed into the knife. It's not a problem at all. Okay, so that's one possible answer. How about kashering? You kosher the knife before you used it. Kashering won't help you from an isur hana'ah if you can't benefit from it. But if it's just kashrut, so you can burn it off, right? You could do libun, okay? You can put it on a fire on it and burn it off. So it's not a problem, okay? So if you burned it in a fire like we do before Pesach, you blowtorch it, it obviously is going to be fine. So we've resolved that side issue of what happened to the kashrut issue. But since we already started with the kashrut issue, they're going to get off on kashrut. So itmar, hashochet b'sakin shel avdei kochavim. What if you used a knife of avdei kochavim and you didn't clean it? Okay? So now, what do you do with your meat? So now, maybe it absorbed from the fat of the non-kosher meat. So Rav Amar kolef, Rabbi Bar Chana Amar midiach. Rav says you cut off what we call, kolef is from the word klipa, which is peel. You cut off what we call kedei klipa. This is a concept we're going to see in kashrut in general, where you cut off a thin layer, in other words, where we assume the fat could have been absorbed. So you cut off that, and you're good. Okay, that's what you have to do. Rabbi Bar Chana says all you need to do is rinse it. Okay, now you have to remember, again, I told you we're going to get into concepts of kashrut here. How does non-kosher stuff get into our food and get absorbed? If everything's cold, we're usually not worried, except for unique circumstances like onions that have sharpness in it and you're chopping them, and the duchke de sakina, like the impact of the knife on onion pulls out the flavor. Okay, things like that. But generally in cold, we don't have, okay, there's all sorts of exceptions. Something's cold, So nothing really gets transferred. If there is, right, let's say there's some fat on it and it got on the meat, so you just rinse it, okay? But if things usually get transferred with heat, okay, if there's heat, then it's a problem. Okay, then it gets absorbed. Once it's absorbed, right, then you have to cut away the area that it could have potentially gotten absorbed into. So the question is, what's this machloket about? Rav who says kolef, cut off some of the layers, and Rabbi Rachana that says just rinse it. So the first attempt, we're going to have 3 attempts to understand the machloket. The first attempt we're going to reject actually, and then the other 2 are going to be possibilities. Lema bahaka miflege. Maybe this is the root of the machloket. Demar savar beit hashchita tzonein, umar savar beit hashchita rotech. Now, when you slaughter an animal, right, what kind of heat is there? Well, blood, right, the blood inside your body has warmth inside of it. There's heat. And they're saying that when you slaughter the animal, it generates heat, and there's a lot of heat in there coming out. So when the knife goes into the animal, the heat is going to make it become absorbed. And that's the machloket. Is it hot there? Is it cold there? It's a reality machloket, okay? What's the reality? Is it, now, no one really thinks it's an extreme, hot or cold, but the question is it hot enough to transfer flavor and get it absorbed in the meat? And that's Rav who says kolef. Or is it not hot enough? And that's Rabbi Barchana, and it's enough to just rinse. That's the first attempt. But the Gemara rejects this and says low. And now they're going to either suggest that they both agree that it's hot, or they both agree that it's cold, and the machloket has to do with something else. So we're going to now say, option number 2 is dekule alma beit hashchita roteachu. Everybody thinks it's hot. Manda amar kolef shapir. So the one who says cut off a layer makes sense because it got absorbed by the heat. Manda amar mediach. Why is it, even if it's hot, why don't you have to worry about it? And all you have to do is rinse it. I did to treat simanim lafu kedam lo bale. Because the simanim are very busy, what are they doing? When you cut those simanim, they're busy spurting blood out, right? You might remember we talked about this in shechita and zvachim, right? That there's the first big spurt of blood that comes out. It's busy spurting blood out. Now, if you're spurting out blood, you can't also absorb at the same point because there's a lot of energy pushing the blood out. So there's no ability for something to be absorbed in. And that's why he says it's enough to just rinse it, because anything that did get absorbed really didn't get absorbed properly, and it could just be rinsed off. Okay, that was option number 2, or you could say option number 1 because we rejected really option number 1. So you can either read it like this, or some people say the opposite, which is to kule alma beit hashchita tzone, and everybody thinks it's cold, which means man damar mediach shapi, right? The one who says rinse it makes a lot more sense. Man damar kolef, and this is something I mentioned before, I particularly dropped it earlier, agav duchka de sakina bala, because of the force of the knife. I talked about with onions, because as you chop with the knife, you put the knife in, that causes more of stuff to be absorbed. So here, because you're pushing the knife inside, the force of the knife is actually forcing, right? It helps, enables the fat that's stuck in the knife to come out and go into the animal, and that's why you have to be kolef. You have to take off more layer, you have to peel off like a whole layer to worry about that. So this was a machloket about slaughtering with a knife that was used for idol worship. Now we're going to talk about another machloket, which is, now this was, what do you do with the meat? Now we're going to move to a different topic. Number 1, we're going to switch Avodah Zeira with a treifa. What if you slaughtered a treifa? Okay, which again is very common that you could do because you slaughtered an animal and then discovered later that the animal was a treifa, okay, that there was something wrong with the animal inside. Or it could be you intentionally slaughtered a treifa and, you saw it was missing a limb, a leg, and you didn't care and you just slaughtered it anyway. Okay, but either which way, you slaughtered a treifa. Now, the animal is not kosher, so the knife, again, absorbed from the non-kosher animal. Now, the question is not, what do you do with the meat? Because you can't eat a treifa anyway. But the question is, how do you kosher it? Okay, how do you fix the knife so you can use the knife again? So, pliga barav achav Ravina, chad amar b'chamin, v'chad amar b'tzonen. One said with heat and one said with cool, meaning either you have to, either burn it off with a blowtorch kind of thing, or in boiling water. And I think actually chamin probably means with boiling water, right? So, tzarich la'agila. You have to put it in like you would kosher in a pot with boiling water. So put the knife in boiling water, that will take out the flavor. The other one says, bitzoning. You just rinse it with cold water. That's fine, that's enough. So now, hilchata filu bitzonin, and the halacha is, even with cold water, it's sufficient. Okay, now, Iika bidaleta, sorry, viika belita de parsa lemichpere lo tzarich. If you have, forget about cold water. You don't even necessarily need water. If you have a piece of cloth, it's this hard kind of cloth, and you wipe it down with that cloth, even that is sufficient because all you have to do is take off the layer of fat that might be on the knife itself. So lamada amar b'chamim my taima mishum de kabbalah isura terenami bala ever minachai. So now they ask a question about the one who said you need hot water. If you know, you need to boil it in hot water. Now they say like this: why would you need to boil it in hot water? Because we assume that when you slaughter the treifa, it absorbed, right? Like probably because of the heat in the area where you're slaughtering, it absorbed from the meat that you were slaughtering. Now they say mishum de kabbalah isura, because what did it absorb? The treifa meat. So now they ask this creative question. Teheteranami bala ever minachai. When you're slaughtering a kosher animal and it's not a treifa, every time you slaughter, according to this opinion, you're going to need a kasher, the knife. Why is that? Because as you start, you're basically touching an ever minachai. You're touching a limb from a live animal. The knife is absorbing from an ever minachai, which is isser, because until you finish the slaughter, right, the animal's still alive. So as you start slaughtering and cutting the first siman, then your knife is now touching something not kosher because it's ever minachai. This is a classic creative Gemara question that temporarily, for that moment in time, it's an ever minachai. So now they say no. How do you resolve that problem? Because emat bala, when does it absorb it? Lechichaima, that's what we said before. It's when it heats up. Remember we said when you slaughter the animal, it creates heat inside, besides the inner heat of the animal, but there's even more heat, right? That would be hot enough. But that there's heat created from the slaughter itself. Well, when does that happen? Emat kachaime. When does it really heat up? When you actually finish the slaughter at the end of the process. And when it absorbs, you've already finished the slaughtering. And as they thought in the beginning that it's going to absorb from heat from already the beginning of the slaughter, and then it's touching ever minachai because the animal at that split second in time is basically it's touching a limb from a live animal that was kind of a dead limb that was taken from a live animal, and that's a problem. But once, right, they're now going to say, no, the real heat that's going to basically cause the flavor to be absorbed into the knife is only at the end of the process. And by that point, the animal's kosher. So that was just a side point in the opinion that we didn't even accept anyway about how hot it is inside and could it really pass on kashrut with heat, which means the only way to remember the rules in kashrut are the way it goes in, that's the way it goes out. If it goes in with heat, then it has to go out with heat. But we seem to be saying otherwise, halachically, we're not really worried about the heat here. We're worried about the fat on the knife because we all know that when you try to clean fat, right, it doesn't come off so easily. So that's what we're worried about, that there might be some fat left over from, before we talked about from a knife that was used for avodah zarah, from a knife used for treifa, okay? That has this fat absorbed in it, and you have to get it out. So in the end, we said you could get it out with cold water, you could get it out with a cloth, a particular kind of cloth that can really do it, so that works. Now, so we started with, okay, let's just go through what we started with here. We started with the hana'ah, the benefit, and then we said shechita is really not benefit, cutting meat would be benefit. Then we moved to a knife, using a knife that was used for avodah zarah. What do you do with the meat? Then we moved to what do you do with a knife that was used for a treifa? And now we're going to get to, if you're a slaughterer, how many knives do you need? Okay, so Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, hatabach tzarich shlosha sakinim. Okay, how do we avoid halakhic issues? We have 3 knives. Echad sheshochet ba, echad shemechatech ba basar, ve'echad shemechatech ba chalavim. Okay, you need 3 knives. One to use for slaughtering, and that one you don't use for anything else. Why is that? Because you have to be very careful that the knife doesn't get a nick. If the knife has nicks in it, then it's going to make the next animal a treifa before you actually finish the slaughtering, and that will ruin your shechita. It's a very big disqualification. So every time the slaughterer slaughters, they always have to check the knife in between. So we're certainly not going to use that knife for anything else, like chopping up the pieces of meat. We want to use that knife only for slaughtering. That's a shechita knife. Next one, the one you cut the meat with. And what's the third one? If you remember, The meat, right, we learned this a lot in Zvachim, the parts that get burned on the altar, those same parts are forbidden in a regular piece of meat. There's certain kind of fats that you're not allowed to eat. So if you're not going to cut the meat with the same knife as the chalev, because again, the chalev is forbidden. So we're going to have one knife for the meat, one knife for the chalev. And because the chalev again is fatty, it'll absorb. If you use it on the meat will end up with chalev in it, which is forbidden. Why don't you just say one knife instead of the two? Okay, forget about the slaughtering knife. And then what are you going to do? First, just make sure your order always is cut the meat, then cut the chalev. The issue is, obviously, after you finish this animal, you're going to clean the knife. But they don't think you're going to clean the knife in between. So who cares? First cut the meat off and then do the chalev second. And then it's fine because you're not going to use the chalev. You're not going to use it for the meat after you did the chalev because you've already cut all the meat. And again, for the next animal, obviously, you'll wash it. So they say, why not? They made exera. They said, listen, have 3 knives because you might accidentally do it in the wrong order and then you'll ruin your meat. So now they say, Hashtanami michlafle. But what do you mean? Okay, now, nowadays you go to a store, you can find a red knife and a green knife and a blue knife, and you can have different colors and know which is which. But in those days, they didn't have different colored knives. They say, okay, it's very nice you have 2 knives, but if you're worried they're going to confuse and do the order wrong, can't you be worried they're going to confuse and use the wrong knife? The one they used on the meat for the chalev for the meat? Say, no, because they said you need 2 separate knives, the butchers are going to remember. Okay, they're going to remember the fact that you have to have 2 knives means that you're always conscious of this issue and you won't confuse which knife is which. Second, another halacha. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, same person, right? Hatabach tzarich shnei kelim shamayim. Echad shemidiach bo basar, v'echad shemidiach bo chalavim. You need 2 different vessels that you're going to rinse the meat in. One you use for the meat and one you use for the chalev. Right? Because again, what's going to happen if you put the chalev in the water to rinse it? Then you're going to end up, okay, why are you rinsing it, by the way? Because you're going to sell it to non-Jews. You can benefit from it, right? We can't eat it, but you're going to sell it to non-Jews. You're going to wash it. But it's going to end up with fatty particles. And if you put a meat in there, the fat's going to get absorbed in the meat. So they say, again, the exact same thing we just said. Why don't you just make sure to do it in that order? Always do the meat first and then the chalev. No, because we're worried you might switch the order and then you'll ruin your meat. But why are you worried they're going to confuse which bowl is which? So, because they require 2, everyone's going to remember. Okay, last sugya for today. Amar Meimar Mishmei Rav Papa. Lo lisraf inish kifle ilave basal bisra. When you're cutting your meat and all that, don't put the meat with the side that has the chalev in it face down on top of another flank of meat. Okay, you have one flank with the chalev facing down on top of another flank of meat, because what's obviously going to happen? Didav tarbu balale bisra. The fat, it's very fatty. And what happens to fatty? It liquefies. And when it liquefies, it's going to get absorbed into the piece of meat below it. So they say, hachi, if you're worried about it liquefying and getting absorbed, ki taritze nami dive tarbu bali bisra. Even if it's face up, it could get absorbed into that flank. And then from there, it'll go down into the flank below. So you should be worried also. Krama mafsik mitatai. They say, no, there's a membrane there that's separating the chalev from the meat. So if the chalev is on the top, there's the membrane in between that and the meat, and it won't drip down. Even if it's on top, then you could, right? Even if it's on top face down, you could say there's a membrane there. They say no, because the whole point is there's membrane under the chalev. So it'll basically be separated anyway. So they say, no, I did mifatat. Since the butcher has his hands there, it could cause the membrane, right? When one's on top of the other and the chalev is face down, the membrane could tear and then the chalev will come out and go get absorbed in the meat below it. Okay. And that ends our sugya for today. So we started with the whole thing, which I'm not going to go through again because we went through it, but the Rabbi Zeira and Shmuel statement about the heating up of the knife, and you can use it anyway, because we're assuming the sharpness of the knife hits first, slaughters the animal before it burns it. Then from there, we got into the other sugya, which we brought them back, our source to try to answer the question, which we couldn't in the end. Then we had we went through again. Shechin of idol worship, can't benefit from it. We had to neutralize the issue of kashrut. Then we went to the issue of kashrut. What if it has the fat absorbed? And then you cut your meat with it. What do we do with the meat? Then we have, what if it was a treifa? How do you kosher the knife? And again, we talked about all sorts of different concepts of kashrut, how kashrut is passed through heat, what do you do when it's cold and it's fat, right? The fat is a whole different category we have to worry about, but more cold, we wash it with cold, we don't have to heat it up to get rid of the kashrut, although we had a debate about it, right? Whether it needs, if you used it for slaughtering because of the heat, maybe you do need to heat it with water, even though we didn't paskin that way. And then we moved into how many knives you need and why you need those 3 knives to avoid, again, the fatty stuff of the chaleb going into your meat. Okay, and then we had some questions on that, and then we moved into this, make sure not to put your chaleb right on top of the meat, because again, the nature, it's really all about the nature of the fat and how the fat can get absorbed and drip down into something else. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone good day and a Shabbat Shalom.